Sometimes, the greatest gifts come wrapped in the most broken packages. When 65-year-old Levi Brenneman lost his beloved wife Sarah after 43 years of marriage, he never imagined that grief would lead him to the most important discovery of his life. The soft-spoken Amish widower had just inherited his black sheep cousin's abandoned farmstead in Lancaster County, a property so rundown that neighbors called it the township's biggest eyesore. The barn was collapsing. Weeds had swallowed the fields, and even his own children thought he was wasting his time. But Levi felt something calling him to that forgotten land. As he began clearing away decades of neglect with patient hands, he found old maps and rusted tools hidden deep in the barn. What those discoveries revealed would shock everyone who had ever doubted him. What would happen when a man who lived by simple faith discovered something worth $200 million buried beneath his feet? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across Levi Brenneman's kitchen table as he sat with calloused hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that had grown cold an hour ago. The silence in the house pressed against him like a physical weight, a silence that had become his constant companion since Sarah's passing 6 months earlier. Her empty chair across from him seemed to hold more presence than all the furniture combined, and her hand-carved wooden cross still hung on the wall where she had placed it 30 years ago, crafted by his own father's patient hands. At 65, Levi carried the weathered dignity that came from 4 decades of working the same 120 acres, raising 3 children, and living by the steady rhythm of seasons in Scripture. His beard, now more silver than brown, framed a face that had learned to find peace in simple things: the smell of fresh-turned earth, the sound of his grandchildren's laughter, the quiet satisfaction of work done well. But since Sarah's heart had simply stopped beating one Tuesday morning while she hung laundry on the line, those simple pleasures felt hollow, like trying to fill a bucket with a hole in the bottom. The legal letter had arrived 3 weeks ago, delivered by a nervous English lawyer who clearly felt uncomfortable navigating the gravel roads of their Amish settlement. Cousin Ezra Brenneman, the family's black sheep, who had left the community 40 years ago and never returned, had died alone in a Philadelphia apartment, leaving Levi his only living heir. The inheritance consisted of 160 acres in the next county over, property that Ezra had owned but never farmed, never even visited, according to the neighbors. "Dottie, are you going to eat your eggs?" 8-year-old Jacob's voice cut through Levi's reverie. His youngest grandchild sat swinging his legs from the kitchen chair, having stopped by with his mother Rebecca for their weekly breakfast together. The boy's bright eyes held the kind of curiosity that reminded Levi painfully of Sarah, always asking questions, always seeing wonder in ordinary things. "I'm sorry, little one." Levi managed to smile and took a bite of the eggs that Rebecca had, prepared exactly the way her mother used to make them. My mind was wandering to places it shouldn't go. Rebecca, his eldest daughter at 38, studied him with the same concerned expression she'd worn since the funeral. She had Sarah's gentle way of reading people's hearts, and Levi knew. She saw right through his attempts at normalcy. Her husband had died in a farming accident 5 years ago, leaving her to raise Jacob alone, and she'd moved back to the family homestead to help care for her parents. Now she felt responsible for her father's well-being, a burden that sat heavy on her shoulders. "Dad, you've been staring at that letter every morning for 3 weeks," she said, nodding toward the legal documents that lay beside his plate. "What? Are you thinking about that old place?" Before Levi could answer, his son Samuel's heavy footsteps echoed on the front porch. At 42, Samuel had inherited his father's broad shoulders and steady temperament, but lately his face carried lines of worry that aged him beyond his years. He ran the family farm now, had done so officially since Levi's heart attack 2 years ago, though the older man still worked alongside him most days. "Morning, Dad. Rebecca." Samuel hung his hat on the peg by the door and accepted a cup of coffee. From his sister, "I've been thinking about this Ezra business. Maybe it's time we drove over there and took a look at what we're dealing with. The neighbors say it's nothing but weeds and rotten wood," Rebecca said, settling Jacob with a plate of fresh biscuits and honey. Mrs. Fisher heard from her cousin that the place hasn't been tended in decades. Why would Ezra leave Dad something he never even cared about? Levi fingered the worn edge of the legal documents. Ezra had been his father's brother's son, 5 years older than Levi, and the source of more family heartache than anyone cared to remember. He'd questioned everything: church, doctrine, community rules, even the wisdom of plain living. At 19, he'd started attending classes at the local college, claiming he wanted to study God's creation through science. The church elders had been patient at first, but when Ezra began spending time with English girls and missing worship services, patience turned to discipline. The final break had come during Levi's wedding to Sarah. Ezra had shown up drunk to the ceremony, disrupting the solemn service with loud questions about whether God really cared what clothes people wore or whether they used electricity. The shame had nearly killed Levi's uncle, and the family had made the painful decision to shun Ezra completely. None of them had spoken to him since. "Your cousin was a troubled soul," Levi said finally, choosing his words carefully in front of Jacob. "But he was family. And family doesn't abandon family, even when they make poor choices." Samuel set down his coffee cup with more force than necessary. "Dad, with respect, Ezra abandoned us. He chose the English world over his own people. Now he's trying to burden you with his mess from beyond the grave. It's not a burden if it's freely given." The words came out more sharply than Levi intended, and he saw Rebecca and Samuel exchange a look that spoke of conversations they'd had about his state of mind. "I'm sorry. I know you're both concerned about me, but I feel called to this. Your mother always said that God works in mysterious ways, and sometimes what looks like a burden is actually a blessing in disguise." Jacob, who had been listening with the intense concentration that children bring to adult conversations they don't fully understand, piped up. "Dottie, is it like when you found that baby bird with the broken wing? Everyone said it was going to die, but you fixed it anyway, and then it flew away." The memory hit Levi like a physical blow. Sarah had been the one to insist they try to save that sparrow. Had set up nights feeding it with an eyedropper while he built a tiny splint for its wing. When it finally flew away, she'd cried tears of pure joy and said it proved that broken things could be made whole with enough patient love. "Yes, Jacob," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "It's exactly like that." Rebecca reached across the table and covered her father's hand with her own. "Dad, we're not trying to stop you from helping family. We're worried about you taking on too much right now. You're still grieving, and this sounds like it could be a lot of work with no guarantee of any return. The neighbors call it Heartbreak Hill," Samuel added, though his tone was gentler now. "They say the only thing growing there is disappointment." Levi stood and walked to the kitchen window, looking out over the fields where he'd spent his whole adult life. The corn was coming up green and strong, the way it had every spring for 40 years. But for the first time, the familiar sight didn't bring him the usual sense of satisfaction. Instead, he felt a restlessness that he couldn't quite name, as if something important remained unfinished. "I want to go see it," he said without turning around. "Today, if possible. I need to understand what Ezra was trying to tell me." "Tell you?" Samuel's voice sharpened. "Dad, the man's been dead for a month. What could he possibly be trying to tell you?" Levi turned back to face his family, and something in his expression made them all fall silent. "Your mother used to say that every piece of ground tells a story if you know how to listen. Ezra may have left our faith, but he was still a Brenneman. He didn't leave me that land by accident." There's a reason, and I won't find peace until I know what it is. The kitchen fell quiet except for the steady tick of the mantel clock. The same clock that had marked time for Sarah's final morning. That had continued its relentless counting even after her heart stopped. Jacob finished his biscuit and climbed down from his chair to stand beside his grandfather, slipping his small hand into Levi's weathered one. "Can I come with you to see the broken farm, Dottie?" Rebecca started to protest, but Levi squeezed the boy's hand gently. "I think that would be a fine idea, little one. Sometimes it takes young eyes to see what old ones miss." Samuel sighed, recognizing defeat when he saw it. His father had the same stubborn streak that had made him successful with both farming and fatherhood. Once Levi Brenneman set his mind to something, arguments were useless. "All right," Samuel said, "but I'm coming with you. And if that place is as bad as everyone says, we're not wasting time on false hopes." Within an hour, they were traveling the back roads in Samuel's buggy. Jacob wedged happily between his grandfather and uncle, chattering about what treasures they might find in an abandoned farm. The countryside rolled past in shades of green and gold, dotted with neat farmhouses and well-tended fields that spoke of generations of careful stewardship. But as they turned down the overgrown lane that led to Ezra's property, the landscape changed. Weeds tall as a man's chest pressed close to the narrow track, and fallen branches from untrimmed trees scraped against the buggy's sides. When they finally reached the farmstead, even Jacob fell silent. The house was a skeleton of rotting wood and broken windows, its front porch sagging like a broken smile. The barn, once red, had faded to the color of dried blood, and half its roof had collapsed inward. Rusty farm equipment lay scattered like the bones of some long-dead creature, and the fields beyond were a tangle of weeds, saplings, and forgotten dreams. "Lord have mercy," Samuel breathed. "Dad, this isn't a farm anymore. It's a graveyard." But Levi wasn't looking at the decay. His eyes were fixed on something else. The way the land lay, the slope of the hills, the quality of the soil beneath the weeds. And there, barely visible under years of neglect, he could see the ghost of what this place had once been. Carefully laid stone walls, the remnants of an orchard, a spring-fed pond that still held clear water despite everything. "It's not dead," he said quietly, stepping down from the buggy. "It's just sleeping." Jacob scrambled down after him, his child's fearlessness intact despite the desolation around them. "Dottie, look. There are still flowers growing by the house." Sure enough, a patch of Sarah's favorite daffodils had somehow survived decades of neglect. Their bright yellow faces turned toward the afternoon sun like tiny prayers of hope. Levi felt something shift in his chest, not quite healing, but the first faint stirring of possibility died as they walked closer to the barn. Samuel grudgingly admitted that the foundation looked solid, and some of the outbuildings might be salvageable with enough work. But his expression remained skeptical, and Levi could read the concern in his son's eyes, worried that his grieving father was chasing an impossible dream. "I know what you're thinking," Levi said as they picked their way through the debris-strewn barnyard, "and you're not wrong to worry. This would be a tremendous undertaking for a man half my age with twice my resources." "Then why?" Samuel started. "Because sometimes we don't choose our callings," Levi interrupted gently. "Sometimes they choose us. And right now, standing here in this broken place, I feel more alive than I have since your mother died. That has to mean something." As if to underscore his words, a red-winged blackbird landed on a nearby fence post and began to sing a pure, clear sound that seemed to mock the desolation around them. Jacob clapped his hands in delight, and even Samuel had to smile at his son's infectious joy. They spent another hour exploring the property, finding both heartbreak and hidden promise in equal measure. As the sun began to sink toward the horizon, painting the weeds and ruins in shades of gold, Levi made a decision that would change all their lives. "I'm going to restore this place," he announced as they climbed back into the buggy. "Not to sell it, not for profit, but because it needs restoring. Because Ezra was family, and this was his dream, even if he never lived to see it fulfilled." Rebecca had been quiet during most of the visit, but now she reached over and took her father's arm. "If this is truly what you feel called to do, then we'll help you. But promise me you won't try to do it all alone. Promise me you'll let your family share the load." Levi looked at his daughter, so much like her mother in her quiet strength, and felt a gratitude that went deeper than words. "I promise," he said. "We'll do this together, as a family should." As they drove home through the gathering dusk, none of them could have imagined the extraordinary discovery that lay hidden beneath those neglected fields, waiting for patient hands to uncover secrets that would test everything they believed about wealth, family, and the true meaning of treasure. But sometimes the most important journeys begin with nothing more than an old man's faith and a child's willingness to believe that broken things can be made beautiful again. The wooden cross Sarah had hung in their kitchen had been carved by hands that understood the value of taking time with important work, of letting each cut serve a purpose larger than itself. Tomorrow, Levi would begin the slow work of restoration, guided by that same patient wisdom and the growing certainty that Ezra's final gift was not a burden at all, but a chance for redemption that would echo through generations yet to come. 3 weeks into the restoration work, Levi had settled into a rhythm as steady and predictable as the seasons themselves. Each morning after chores at his own farm, he would harness his Mare Buttercup to the wagon and make the hour-long journey to what the family had begun calling Ezra's place. He brought simple tools: hammer, nails, wire cutters, and the kind of patient determination that had served him well through 4 decades of farming. The work progressed slowly but steadily. He'd cleared the worst of the debris from around the farmhouse, patched the most dangerous holes in the barn floor, and begun the tedious process of pulling weeds that had grown thick as his arm. Jacob often accompanied him on Saturdays, chattering cheerfully as he helped sort nails and carry water from the spring. The boy's enthusiasm never flagged. Even when faced with tasks that would have discouraged adults, it was on a particularly warm Thursday morning in late May that Levi made the discovery that would change everything. He was working alone in the barn, trying to clear out decades of accumulated junk from what had once been the feed room. The space was dark despite the holes in the roof, and dust motes danced in the occasional shafts of sunlight like tiny spirits, celebrating his progress. Most of what he found was exactly what he'd expected: rotted feed sacks, broken tools, the skeletal remains of farm equipment that hadn't run since before Jacob was born. But as he moved a pile of moldy hay bales that had somehow survived the years, his foot hit something solid that shouldn't have been there. Brushing away the debris revealed a wooden trapdoor built into the barn floor, so cunningly concealed that it would have been invisible under normal circumstances. The wood was solid oak, aged but well preserved, and secured with a simple iron latch that moved smoothly despite decades of disuse. Levi's pulse quickened as he lifted the heavy door, revealing wooden steps that descended into darkness. The underground room was small but carefully constructed, with stone walls that had kept it dry despite the bar's deterioration above. And there, arranged as methodically as Sarah had organized her preserves, sat the most extraordinary collection of items Levi had ever seen. Maps covered one entire wall, geological surveys, topographical charts, and hand-drawn diagrams that showed the property from angles Levi had never considered. Some bore official seals from the Pennsylvania Department of Natural Resources, while others appeared to be the work of private surveying companies. All were dated within the last 10 years of Ezra's life, suggesting he had been actively researching the land right up until his death. But the maps were just the beginning. Wooden crates lined the opposite wall, filled with rock samples that had been carefully labeled and cataloged. Each specimen bore a small tag written in Ezra's neat handwriting, with notations that meant nothing to Levi, but clearly held significance for someone with geological training. Some of the rocks were ordinary limestone and shale, common to the area. Others had an unusual weight and coloration that suggested they were something far more valuable. The centerpiece of the hidden room was a leather-bound journal, its pages yellowed with age but perfectly preserved in the dry environment. Levi opened it with trembling hands and found page after page of meticulous notes written in Ezra's familiar script. The same careful penmanship that had once copied Bible verses for Sunday school, now devoted to recording mineral compositions, soil density measurements, and something called rare earth element concentrations. As he read by the light of his battery-powered lantern, Levi began to understand that his black sheep cousin had spent the last decades of his life engaged in work far more sophisticated than anyone in the family had imagined. Ezra had apparently earned a degree in geology from the University of Pennsylvania, something he had never shared with his Amish relatives, and had been conducting a systematic survey of mineral deposits throughout Lancaster County. The journal entries grew more excited as they progressed through the years. Early notes were cautious, clinical observations about soil composition and rock formations. But by the final entries written just months before Ezra's death, the language had become almost fervent. The Lord's hidden treasures lie beneath this ground, waiting for righteous hands to uncover them. The deposits here exceed anything I have found elsewhere. This land holds wealth beyond imagining, but it must be protected from those who would exploit it for mere profit. One phrase appeared again and again in the later entries. For the generations yet to come. It became clear that Ezra saw himself as a steward rather than an owner, someone called to protect resources that belonged to the future rather than the present. The implications hit Levi like a physical blow. If Ezra's research was accurate, the worthless property that everyone had been urging him to abandon might actually contain mineral deposits of enormous value. But even more significant was the realization that his cousin had never intended to profit from this discovery himself. Every note, every carefully preserved sample, every detailed map spoke of someone preparing the way for others, specifically for the family member who would inherit the land after his death. Ezra, Levi whispered in the darkness of the hidden room, "What were you trying to tell us?" The sound of footsteps above interrupted his thoughts, followed by Samuel's voice calling his name. Levi quickly closed the journal and climbed the stairs, pulling the trapdoor shut behind him. He wasn't ready to share this discovery, yet needed time to understand what it meant before subjecting it to his family's practical skepticism. "Dad, are you in here?" Samuel appeared in the barn doorway, squinting as his eyes adjusted to the dim light. "Rebecca sent me to check on you. You've been here longer than usual." "Just lost track of time," Levi said, hoping his voice sounded normal. "This old barn has more secrets than I expected." Samuel looked around at the cleared space with grudging approval. "I have to admit, it's looking better than I thought it would. You might actually be able to use this building again with enough work." "That's the plan." Levi gathered up his tools, his mind still reeling from what he'd discovered. "Tell Rebecca I'll be home for supper. I just want to finish clearing this last section." After Samuel left, Levi returned to the hidden room, carefully studying the maps by lantern light. If he was reading them correctly, the mineral deposits extended far beyond the boundaries of Ezra's property, potentially affecting several neighboring farms. The implications were staggering, not just for his own family, but for the entire Amish community. But as he sat surrounded by his cousin's life work, Levi also felt a growing sense of unease. Ezra had hidden this discovery for a reason, had gone to extraordinary lengths to keep it secret, even from family. The journal's later entries hinted at contact with mining companies, legal research about mineral rights, and what sounded like threats from people who wanted access to the land. They do not understand that some treasures are not meant to be seized but protected, read one particularly cryptic entry. The English think all wealth belongs to the highest bidder, but the Lord has other plans. This inheritance must go to one who understands stewardship over ownership, preservation over profit. As evening shadows lengthened across the barn floor, Levi made his decision. He would research Ezra's findings quietly, perhaps consult with experts who could help him understand what he was dealing with. But he would tell no one, not even his children, until he knew more about the magnitude of the discovery and the best way to handle it. He carefully returned the journal to its place, secured the trapdoor, and scattered enough debris to conceal its existence. But as he drove home through the peaceful countryside, his mind was anything but peaceful. Ezra had left him more than a rundown farm. He had left him a responsibility that could change everything the Amish community stood for. That night, as he sat at his kitchen table reading his Bible as was his custom, Levi found his eyes drawn repeatedly to the parable of the hidden treasure. The kingdom of heaven is like treasure hidden in a field. When a man found it, he hid it again, and then in his joy went and sold all he had and bought that field. But unlike the man in the parable, Levi wasn't sure that joy was what he felt. Instead, he felt the weight of his secret that was too large for one person to carry, and the growing certainty that his quiet life was about to become very complicated indeed. Somewhere in the darkness beyond his kitchen window, Ezra's land waited patiently for the dawn, holding secrets that would test everything Levi thought he knew about wealth, family, and the price of doing what was right. The brass compass lay heavy in Levi's calloused palm, its antique face catching the morning light that streamed through his kitchen window. He had found it wrapped in oiled cloth beneath Ezra's journal, and according to the inscription on its back, it had belonged to a surveyor named Thomas Whitmore in 1887. More importantly, when he held it over the geological maps in the hidden room, its needle pointed consistently toward a specific section of the property, the same area where Ezra's notes indicated the richest mineral deposits lay. For 2 weeks, Levi had been carrying the compass everywhere, studying the maps in secret, and trying to understand the technical language that filled his cousin's journal. Words like lanthanides and rare earth elements meant nothing to him, but the dollar figures scattered throughout Ezra's calculations were impossible to ignore. Even the most conservative estimates suggested deposits worth tens of millions of dollars. The weight of this knowledge pressed down on him like a physical burden. During family meals, he found himself distracted and quiet, his mind wandering to the implications of what lay beneath that seemingly worthless farmland. Samuel had commented more than once on his father's preoccupation, and Rebecca had taken to watching him with the kind of concerned attention she'd shown during his recovery from the heart attack. It was Jacob who provided the solution, though he had no idea of the service he was performing. "Dottie, why you look so sad when you hold that old compass?" the boy asked one Saturday morning as they prepared to leave for the farm. "Is it because it belonged to someone who died?" "All compasses belong to someone who died eventually," Levi replied, then immediately regretted the morbid observation. "I'm sorry, little one. I've been thinking too much about serious things lately. Mama says when she thinks too much, she talks to smart people who know about things she doesn't know. Maybe you should find a smart person who knows about old compasses." The innocent wisdom hit Levi like lightning. Of course, he didn't have to carry this burden alone. He needed expert advice, someone who could help him understand what Ezra had discovered and what it might mean for their community. But it would have to be someone he could trust, someone who wouldn't immediately see dollar signs and start making phone calls to mining companies. That afternoon, while Jacob played contentedly in the restored section of the barn, Levi drove to Millersville University. He had never set foot on a college campus before, but desperation made him bold. The geology department occupied a modern building that seemed as foreign to him as another planet. But the secretary was kind enough to direct him to the office of Dr. Sarah Chun, a recently retired professor who still maintained a small office. For her research, Dr. Chun was a small, energetic woman in her 70s, with silver hair and intelligent eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. She looked up from a desk covered with rock samples when Levi knocked hesitantly on her doorframe. "Can I help you?" she asked, and something in her voice suggested she was accustomed to dealing with people who felt out of place in academic settings. "I hope so, ma'am. My name is Levi Brenneman, and I have some questions about rocks and such. I was told you might be able to help me understand some things I've found on my property." Dr. Chun studied him for a moment, taking in his plain clothes and obviously uncomfortable demeanor, and smiled warmly. "Mr. Brenneman, please come in and sit down. I love talking about rocks, especially when they're found by people who aren't sure what they're looking at. What kind of things have you found?" For the next hour, Levi carefully shared selected portions of Ezra's research, describing it as materials he'd found while cleaning out his cousin's belongings. He showed her photocopies he'd made of some of the maps and a few of the less significant rock samples, keeping the most important discoveries to himself until he could gauge her trustworthiness. Dr. Chen's excitement was immediate and infectious. "Mr. Brenneman, your cousin appears to have been conducting a very sophisticated geological survey. These mineral samples are quite unusual for this area. Some of them contain elements I haven't seen in Pennsylvania formations before." She moved to a cabinet filled with testing equipment and began examining the samples under a powerful magnifying glass, occasionally making small notes on a pad. "Would it be possible for me to run some more detailed tests on these?" "Nothing destructive. Just spectrographic analysis to determine the exact composition." "What would that tell you?" Levi asked, his pulse quickening. "Well, based on what I can see here, your cousin may have discovered some very interesting mineral formations. These samples contain what appear to be rare earth elements materials that are extremely valuable for modern electronics, renewable energy systems, and advanced manufacturing." Levi felt as if the room had suddenly become too small. "Valuable how?" Dr. Chun set down her magnifying glass and looked at him seriously. "Mr. Brenneman, depending on the concentration and extent of these deposits, we could be talking about a discovery worth many millions of dollars. Rare earth elements are among the most sought-after materials in the modern world." The drive home passed in a blur of conflicting emotions. Relief that Ezra's research appeared to be legitimate warred with dread about what this confirmation might mean for his family and community. Dr. Chun had offered to continue her analysis and provide a more detailed assessment, but she had also mentioned that such discoveries typically attracted attention from mining companies and government agencies. That evening, as he sat at his kitchen table trying to process what he'd learned, Levi found himself staring at the wooden cross on the wall. His father had carved it during the winter Levi was born, working slowly and carefully through the long evenings while snow piled up outside their windows. It had been made with patience and love, created not for profit, but for the simple joy of making something beautiful and meaningful. The contrast with what lay beneath Ezra's land could not have been more stark. Here was wealth that had nothing to do with patient labor or spiritual purpose, riches that existed by geological accident rather than human effort. And yet, Ezra's journal made it clear that his cousin had seen the discovery in spiritual terms, as a treasure, entrusted to him for purposes larger than personal gain. The sound of approaching footsteps interrupted his thoughts. Samuel appeared at the kitchen door, his expression serious. "Dad, we need to talk. Rebecca and I have been discussing your project over at Ezra's place. We're worried about you." Levi gestured for his son to sit down, pouring him a cup of coffee from the pot that always stayed warm on the stove. "What kind of worried?" You've been different since you started working on that farm. Distracted, secretive. You disappear for hours at a time, and when you come back, you look like you're carrying the weight of the world on your shoulders." Samuel paused, choosing his words carefully. "Rebecca thinks maybe the grief is affecting your judgment. That maybe you're putting too much emotional investment into that property because it's connected to family, even family that hurt us." The concern in his son's voice was genuine, and Levi felt a stab of guilt for the secrets he was keeping. But he wasn't ready to share Ezra's discovery, not until he understood better what it would mean for all of them. "The work is good for me," he said finally. "It gives me purpose, something to focus on besides missing your mother. And I think Ezra deserves to have his property treated with respect, regardless of how he lived his life." Samuel studied his father's face in the lamplight, clearly sensing that there was more to the story than he was being told. "Dad, if this project is going to become a financial burden on the family, we need to discuss it openly. The farm needs attention too, and you're not getting any younger." "I understand your concerns," Levi replied, "and I promise you that I won't do anything to harm this family's welfare. But sometimes a man needs to follow his conscience, even when others don't understand the reasons." As Samuel left for his own house across the fields, Levi remained at the kitchen table long into the night, the brass compass spinning slowly in his palm. Tomorrow he would return to Dr. Chun's office to learn more about what Ezra had left him. But tonight he sat with the weight of secrets and the growing certainty that his quiet life was about to be tested in ways he had never imagined. The faded sepia photograph trembled in Levi's weathered hands as he studied the faces of 3 young men, standing beside surveying equipment in what appeared to be a Pennsylvania field. The image, tucked between pages of Ezra's journal, was dated 1982 on the back in his cousin's careful handwriting. E. Brenneman, Dr. James Morrison, Robert Chun. Preliminary survey, Lancaster County rare earth deposits. Dr. Sarah Chen had nearly dropped her coffee cup when Levi showed her the photograph at their second meeting. "Robert Chun was my late husband," she said, her voice filled with amazement. "He spent his entire career studying geological formations in Pennsylvania, but he never mentioned working with an Amish researcher. This is extraordinary, Mr. Brenneman. Your cousin appears to have been far more educated than anyone in your family realized." The revelations kept coming. Dr. Chun's preliminary analysis of the rock samples had confirmed Ezra's most optimistic projections. The mineral concentrations were not only significant but unprecedented in the region. Conservative estimates suggested deposits worth between $50 and $100 million. With the possibility of much higher values if the formations extended as deep as Ezra's notes indicated. "Your cousin was brilliant," Dr. Chun continued, spreading additional geological surveys across her desk. "These calculations show the kind of sophisticated understanding that only comes from advanced training." Where did he study? Levi felt as though he was learning about a complete stranger. "We lost touch with Ezra 40 years ago when he left our community. I had no idea he'd gotten an education, let alone become some kind of scientist." "Not just any scientist," Dr. Chun said, pulling a thick folder from her filing cabinet. "My husband kept detailed records of all his research partnerships. According to his notes, your cousin earned a master's degree in geological engineering from Penn State and spent summers working with some of the most respected mineral surveyors in the country. He was apparently quite gifted." The weight of family. History pressed down on Levi as he absorbed this information. While the Brenneman family had spent 40 years mourning Ezra as a lost soul who had abandoned his faith for worldly pursuits, he had actually been building expertise that would ultimately benefit the very community that had shunned him. The irony was almost too painful to contemplate, but the family's reaction to hints about his discoveries was anything but supportive. "Dad, this is getting out of hand," Rebecca said during their Thursday family dinner, her voice tight with frustration. Mrs. Yoder told me you were seen at the university talking to English professors. People are starting to gossip about what you're doing over at that property. Samuel set down his fork with visible irritation. And yesterday, I had 3 different neighbors ask me if you were planning to sell Ezra's land to developers. The rumors are getting ridiculous. What rumors? Levi asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. People are saying you've been acting strange, spending money on consultants, making secret trips to places you've never been before, Rebecca said. Elder Stoltzfus asked me directly if you were having second thoughts about plain living. The accusation hit Levi like a physical blow. In Amish communities, questioning someone's commitment to simple living was tantamount to questioning their faith itself. He looked around the kitchen table at his family, Rebecca's worried face, Samuel's frustrated expression, and Jacob's wide eyes taking in the adult tension he didn't fully understand. I have never wavered in my faith, Levi said, quietly, but with steel in his voice. What I'm doing at Ezra's property is exactly what our faith teaches, caring for family, being a good steward of what God has entrusted to me. But what exactly are you doing? Samuel pressed. You disappear for hours at a time. You're distracted during family conversations, and now you're consulting with university professors about rocks. It doesn't make sense, Dad. Before Levi could answer, Jacob piped up from his end of the table. Dottie found treasure maps in the broken barn. He showed me the old compass that points to secret places. The kitchen fell silent except for the tick of the mantel clock. Rebecca and Samuel stared at their father with expressions that mixed shock with something approaching betrayal. Treasure maps? Rebecca's voice was barely above a whisper. Dad, what haven't you told us? Levi felt the weight of weeks of secrecy pressing against his chest. He had tried to protect his family from worry, to understand the full implications, before sharing Ezra's discovery. But looking at their faces now, he realized his silence had created exactly the kind of suspicion and hurt he had hoped to avoid. Sit down, he said, gesturing toward the chairs they had just vacated. All of you, it's time I told you what Ezra left us. For the next hour, Levi shared everything. The hidden room, the geological surveys, Ezra's scientific background, and Dr. Chun's preliminary assessment of the mineral deposits. He watched his children's expressions shift from disbelief to amazement to a kind of stunned silence that felt heavier than any words. When he finished, Samuel was the first to speak. $100 million? His voice cracked on the numbers. Dad, are you absolutely certain about this? As certain as I can be, without bringing in mining companies to do full-scale testing, Levi replied. And that's exactly what I'm trying to avoid until we decide as a family how to handle this. Rebecca had gone pale during his explanation. This changes everything, doesn't it? I mean, this isn't just about you anymore. If word gets out about deposits worth that much money, people are going to come looking. Outsiders, corporations, maybe even the government. Which is why I've been trying to keep it quiet until we understand our options, Levi said. But clearly, I've done a poor job of that. Samuel stood and walked to the kitchen window, staring out at fields that suddenly seemed small and ordinary, compared to the wealth that might lie beneath Ezra's property. Dad, I need to ask you something, and I want a completely honest answer. Are you planning to sell that land to mining companies? The question hung in the air like smoke from a fire that couldn't be extinguished. Levi looked at his son's tense shoulders, at Rebecca's worried face, at Jacob's innocent curiosity, and felt the full weight of the decision that lay before him. I don't know, he said finally, and the admission felt like a physical pain. I've been praying about it every night since I found Ezra's research, and I still don't know what the right answer is. The right answer is obvious, Samuel said, turning back to face him. We're Amish, Dad. We don't pursue wealth for its own sake. We live simply. We work with our hands, and we trust God to provide what we need. This mineral deposit thing goes against everything we believe. But Rebecca was shaking her head. It's not that simple, Samuel. Dad didn't go looking for this wealth, it found him. And if Ezra spent decades researching this, he must have had reasons for keeping it secret and leaving it to Dad specifically. Ezra left our faith, Samuel countered. Why should we trust his judgment about anything? Because, Jacob set in, the matter-of-fact way children have of cutting through adult complications. Maybe he was trying to say he was sorry for hurting the family. Maybe the treasure is like a present to make up for being mean. The adults fell silent, struck by the boy's simple interpretation. Levi reached over and pulled his grandson close, feeling the solid warmth of the child's trust and innocence. Out of the mouths of babes, he murmured, remembering Sarah's favorite saying for moments when Jacob's wisdom exceeded his years. As evening settled over the farmhouse, the family sat together processing the magnitude of what they'd learned. Outside the kitchen windows, the familiar landscape of their settlement looked the same as always: neat fields, well-tended barns, the peaceful order of a community that had remained unchanged for generations. But inside that kitchen, everything had shifted. We need time to think about this, Rebecca said finally, and we need to pray about it as a family. But Dad, you can't handle this alone anymore. Whatever we decide together. Samuel nodded reluctantly, and in the meantime, we keep this completely private. If the community finds out about mineral deposits worth that much money, it'll tear us apart. Levi agreed, though he suspected that keeping such a momentous secret would prove easier said than done. Already, he could see the burden of knowledge settling on his children's shoulders, the way it had weighed on him for weeks. But there was also something else in their faces, a growing awareness that their family had been chosen for something larger than themselves, something that would test not just their faith, but their understanding of what it meant to be good stewards of unexpected gifts. As they prepared for evening prayers, Levi found himself hoping that Ezra, wherever he was, could somehow know that his final act of love for the family that had rejected him was finally being understood. The clay pottery shard lay on Dr. Chun's laboratory table like a whisper from the distant past, its surface decorated with faded geometric patterns that spoke of hands that had worked this same soil centuries before European settlers ever dreamed of Pennsylvania. Levi had found it while examining the area where Ezra's compass consistently pointed, buried just beneath the surface near what appeared to be an ancient spring. This is Susquehannock work, Dr. Chun said, adjusting her magnifying glass to better examine the intricate designs. Probably 17th century, maybe earlier. Mr. Brenneman, this pottery fragment suggests that Native Americans considered this particular spot significant long before your cousin discovered the mineral deposits. The implications sent a chill down Levi's spine. Significant how? Many Native American cultures had sophisticated understanding of geological formations. They often established settlements near natural resources, salt deposits, iron ore sources of clay for pottery. It's quite possible they knew about the unusual mineral formations beneath this land and considered it sacred. Dr. Chun set down her magnifying glass and pulled out a thick folder, which brings me to the results of my full analysis. Mr. Brenneman, I'm afraid the situation is even more extraordinary than we initially thought. The geological report she spread across the table contained charts and graphs that meant little to Levi, but the summary at the end was written in language anyone could understand. The mineral deposits beneath Ezra's property were not merely valuable. They were among the richest concentrations of rare earth elements ever discovered in North America. Conservative estimates now place the total value at well over $200 million. The deposits extend far deeper than your cousin initially calculated, Dr. Chun explained, pointing to cross-sectional diagrams of the underground formations. And they appear to be part of a much larger geological structure that could affect several neighboring properties as well. Levi felt the familiar weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders like a yoke. Dr. Chun, what would happen if word of this discovery got out? Her expression grew serious. Complete transformation of this area, I'm afraid. Mining companies would descend like locusts, property values would skyrocket, and your peaceful rural community would become the center of an industrial operation that could last decades. The drive home from the university took place in a haze of conflicted emotions. $200 million, the number seemed almost meaningless in its enormity. But the image of industrial mining equipment tearing up the peaceful countryside where Jacob played and his neighbors lived their quiet lives was all too vivid. That afternoon brought an unexpected visitor to Ezra's property. Levi was working on replacing some of the barn's broken siding when a sleek black sedan pulled up the overgrown lane, the first motorized vehicle to visit the property since he'd begun the restoration work. The man who emerged from the car looked out of place in the rural setting, dressed in an expensive suit despite the warm weather and picking his way carefully around puddles in leather shoes that had clearly never touched farm soil. He was perhaps 50 years old, with the kind of polished appearance that spoke of boardrooms and corporate offices. Mr. Brenneman? The stranger approached with an extended hand and a practiced smile. My name is Marcus Webb, and I represent Keystone Mining Corporation. I wonder if I might have a few minutes of your time. Levi accepted the handshake warily, noting the man's soft grip and manicured nails hands that had never held honest tools or known the satisfaction of physical labor. What can I do for you, Mr. Webb? Well, sir, we've heard through the grapevine that you've inherited this property from your cousin, and we thought you might be interested in discussing some opportunities for development. The casual mention of opportunities made Levi's pulse quicken. How much did this man know about Ezra's discoveries? And more importantly, who had told him? What kind of development? Levi asked, keeping his voice neutral. Webb's smile broadened, but something predatory flickered behind his eyes. Keystone Mining specializes in extracting valuable minerals from properties that might otherwise sit undeveloped. We've done extensive research on geological formations in this area, and we believe your land might have significant potential. Potential? For what? Well, that would depend on what our surveys reveal. But I can tell you that we've made very generous offers to other landowners in similar situations. We're talking about enough money to set you and your family up for life, Mr. Brenneman. Enough to leave your children and grandchildren completely financially secure. Levi studied the man's face, noting the calculated way he emphasized financial security, clearly targeting what he assumed would be an Amish farmer's primary concerns. And what would happen to the land itself? Webb waved a dismissive hand. Oh, our operations are very respectful of the environment. Modern mining techniques are much cleaner than they used to be. And of course, once we've completed our extraction work, the land would be restored to agricultural use. The lies came so smoothly that Levi wondered how many rural families Webb had deceived with similar promises. He thought of Dr. Chun's description of what large-scale rare earth mining actually involved: massive open pits, chemical processing facilities, contaminated groundwater that could take decades to clean up. I appreciate your interest, Levi said carefully, but I'm not looking to sell at this time. Webb's expression shifted subtly, the practiced smile becoming a bit more forced. Mr. Brenneman, I hope you'll reconsider. Keystone Mining has significant resources at our disposal, and we've found that most property owners find our offers very compelling once they understand the full scope of what we're proposing. There was something in the man's tone that sounded less like a business proposition and more like a veiled threat. Levi felt his backbone straighten in response. Like I said, I'm not interested in selling. This property has family significance that can't be measured in dollars. Webb reached into his jacket and pulled out an elegant business card. Well, perhaps you'll change your mind once you've had time to consider the alternatives. Development in this area is going to happen one way or another. Mr. Brenneman, it would be much better for everyone involved if it happened with willing participation from local landowners. After Webb left, Levi stood alone in the barnyard feeling as though he'd just been visited by a serpent in an expensive suit. The man's final words echoed in his mind. Development is going to happen one way or another. The implication was clear. Keystone Mining knew about the mineral deposits and intended to access them regardless of what local landowners preferred. That evening, as he sat at his kitchen table trying to process the day's revelations, Levi found himself staring at the clay pottery shard he'd brought home from Dr. Chen's laboratory. The ancient design seemed to pulse with significance in the lamplight, reminding him that this land had been considered sacred by people who understood the long view of stewardship his ancestors had come to. Pennsylvania seeking religious freedom, the right to live according to their beliefs without interference from those who valued profit over principle. Now he found himself facing the same challenge. How to protect something precious from those who saw only its monetary value? The weight of $200 million in mineral wealth felt heavier than any burden he had ever carried. But as he held the pottery fragment in his calloused hands, Levi began to understand that Ezra's final gift was not just the discovery itself, but the opportunity to prove that some treasures were too valuable to be sold. Sarah's recipe box sat open on the kitchen table, its worn wooden surface polished smooth by decades of loving use. Each handwritten card represented more than just instructions for bread or jam or the molasses cookies Jacob loved. They were tangible connections to a woman who had understood that true wealth had nothing to do with bank accounts or mineral deposits. Levi ran his fingers over Sarah's careful script as he read her recipe for friendship bread, complete with notes about which neighbors preferred extra cinnamon and reminders to always make extra loaves for families going through difficult times. Here was a different kind of treasure entirely, one that had grown more valuable through sharing rather than hoarding. The contrast with the morning's news could not have been more stark. Dr. Chen had called with the final geological assessment, and the numbers were staggering, even by her scientific standards. The rare earth deposits beneath Ezra's property were valued at over $200 million, making it potentially the most valuable undeveloped mineral site on the East Coast. "Mr. Brenneman," she had said, her voice tight with excitement and concern, "you need to understand what this means. Once word of this discovery spreads, and it will spread, your quiet life is going to change dramatically. Mining companies, investors, government agencies, media attention. It's going to be overwhelming." The media attention had already begun. That morning, a reporter from the Lancaster New Era had appeared at Levi's front door asking questions about unusual geological activity in the area and rumors of significant mineral discoveries. Levi had politely declined to comment, but the reporter's presence meant the secret was already leaking beyond their small circle of trusted confidants. The stress was taking its toll on the entire family. Rebecca had developed dark circles under her eyes from sleepless nights, worrying about what the discovery might mean for their community. Samuel's usual steady demeanor had given way to short temper and worried silence. Even Jacob had begun asking questions about why the adults seemed so troubled lately. But the most immediate crisis was developing within the Amish community itself. Word of Levi's strange behavior and mysterious consultations with English professors had reached the church elders, and this morning had brought a formal visit from Bishop Ely Stoltzfus and 2 other senior members of their district. "Levi," Bishop Stoltzfus had said, settling his considerable bulk into a kitchen chair while his companions flanked him like stern bookends. "There are concerns about your recent activities. Reports of secret meetings, consultations with worldly institutions, pursuit of matters that have no place in a plain life. The bishop's weathered face showed the kind of disappointment reserved for members who appeared to be straying from the path of righteousness. Some in the community are wondering if your grief has led you to question our ways, to seek answers in places where faith should suffice. Levi had tried to explain without revealing the true nature of Ezra's discovery, speaking vaguely about family obligations and proper stewardship of inherited property. But his evasions only seemed to deepen the bishop's concerns. "Brother," Bishop Stoltzfus had continued, his voice heavy with authority, "the pursuit of worldly knowledge for its own sake leads away from God, not toward Him. Our people have thrived for generations by keeping our lives simple, our hearts humble, and our focus on eternal rather than temporal matters." The conversation had ended with a gentle but unmistakable warning. If Levi continued down his current path, the community would be forced to consider more serious measures to address his apparent spiritual crisis. The threat of formal discipline or even shunning hung in the air like smoke from a fire that threatened to consume everything he held dear. Now, as evening shadows lengthened across his kitchen, Levi found himself facing the most difficult decision of his life. The recipe box offered one kind of wisdom, the accumulated understanding of a woman who had found profound satisfaction in simple acts of love and service. But Ezra's hidden research offered another perspective entirely, the possibility that God had entrusted him with resources that could benefit not just his own family, but entire communities for generations to come. The sound of familiar footsteps interrupted his brooding. Samuel appeared at the kitchen door, his face grim with news that clearly weighed heavy on his conscience. "Dad, we need to talk. I've been hearing things in town today, and I think our situation is more serious than we realized." Samuel sat down across from his father and ran his hands through his hair, a gesture of stress that reminded Levi painfully of Sarah's similar habit during difficult times. "Jeremiah Miller stopped by the feed store today. He said Marcus Webb approached him about selling his farm, offered him twice what the property's worth if he'd sell immediately, no questions asked." Levi felt his stomach clench. The Miller farm bordered Ezra's property on the north side, and if Dr. Chen was correct about the extent of the mineral deposits, Jeremiah's land might be just as valuable as his own. What did Jeremiah tell him? Same thing you did, that he wasn't interested in selling. But Webb didn't take no for an answer. He started asking questions about who owns what land around here, how long families have been established, whether anyone might be facing financial pressures. Samuel leaned forward, his voice dropping to an urgent whisper. "Dad, I think this mining company is planning to target our entire community. They're going to try to buy up every farm in the area, whether the owners want to sell or not." The implications hit Levi like a physical blow. If Keystone Mining succeeded in acquiring the surrounding properties, they could essentially force him to sell by making his land the center of industrial operations that would make normal farming impossible. The company wouldn't need his cooperation. They could simply make his life unbearable until selling became his only option. "There's more," Samuel continued. Webb made some comments to Jeremiah about how Amish communities are resistant to progress and might need encouragement to see reason. He mentioned something about tax assessments and zoning, changes that could make it difficult for traditional farming operations to continue. The threat was becoming clearer. Keystone Mining wasn't just interested in buying land. They were prepared to use legal and political pressure to force sales from reluctant property owners. Their resources were virtually unlimited, while the Amish community's resistance to engaging with outside legal systems made them particularly vulnerable to such tactics. "Samuel," Levi said, his voice heavy with the weight of decision, "I need to tell you something about why this mining company is so interested in our area. And I need you to help me figure out how to protect not just our family, but our entire community." As father and son sat together in the gathering darkness, surrounded by Sarah's recipes for the simple joys of daily life, Levi began to explain the full magnitude of what Ezra had discovered and what it might mean for everyone they loved. Outside their kitchen windows, the peaceful landscape of their settlement stretched away toward the horizon, looking exactly as it had for generations. But both men knew the peace was about to be tested in ways their ancestors could never have imagined. The recipe box sat open between them, Sarah's handwritten wisdom offering silent testimony to the truth that some treasures grew more valuable when shared, while others were destroyed by the very act of pursuit. The challenge now was determining which kind of treasure lay buried beneath Ezra's land, and whether their community had the strength to protect what mattered most when powerful forces came seeking to take it away. The legal document that would change everything lay buried beneath a stack of geological surveys in the safety deposit box that Levi had never known existed. The key hand-forged iron crafted by Ezra himself during his final months had been hidden inside the spine of his cousin's journal, discovered only when Jacob accidentally knocked the book from the table and the binding split open. "Dottie, look! The book has a secret hiding place," the boy had exclaimed, his eyes wide with the kind of delight only children feel when discovering hidden treasures. Now, as Levi sat in the sterile environment of the First National Bank with the box's contents spread before him, he understood that Ezra's final gift was far more sophisticated than anyone had imagined. His cousin hadn't just discovered mineral wealth. He had spent years preparing legal defenses to protect it. The document that lay on top of the pile was a deed dating back to 1847, yellowed with age but perfectly preserved, bearing the official seal of the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. But it wasn't the age of the document that made Levi's hands tremble as he read it. It was what it said about mineral rights. According to the original land grant, all mineral rights on the property were to remain in perpetuity with the Brenneman family line, to be held in trust for future generations and not to be severed from the surface rights under any circumstances. The language was archaic but legally binding, and it meant that no mining company could claim prior rights to the deposits beneath Ezra's land. But that was only the beginning of Ezra's preparations. A thick folder marked Legal Research, Mineral Rights Protection contained correspondence with environmental lawyers, documentation of similar cases across the country, and a detailed strategy for defending the property against corporate acquisition attempts. Ezra had apparently spent the last 5 years of his life building an impenetrable legal fortress around his discovery. He knew, Levi whispered to himself in the bank's quiet safety deposit room. Somehow, he knew exactly what would happen. The final item in the box was a sealed letter addressed simply to my heir. Levi opened it with trembling fingers and found 3 pages of Ezra's careful handwriting, dated just 2 months before his death. "My dear cousin, if you are reading this, then God has worked through my death to accomplish what I could never achieve in life, bringing our family back together around something larger than our old disagreements. I know that my leaving caused great pain, and I have carried the weight of that hurt for 40 years. But perhaps now you can understand that my path, however wrong it may have seemed, led to something that could benefit our people for generations to come. I have spent my adult life studying God's creation through the lens of science, and I have learned that the earth holds treasures beyond imagining. Beneath the property I am leaving you lies wealth that could transform our entire community, but only if it is handled with the wisdom our people have always shown in matters of stewardship, rather than ownership. The mining companies will come, Levi. They are already circling like vultures, using lawyers and politicians and promises of easy money to steal what belongs to families like ours. But I have prepared defenses that they cannot break, legal protections that will hold as long as our family maintains ownership of the land. The choice is yours now. You can sell to the highest bidder and become rich beyond imagining. Or you can do what I believe God intends: protect this treasure for future generations, ensuring that it benefits our people and our way of life rather than destroying it. I know what our ancestors would choose. The same faith that brought them across an ocean in search of religious freedom must now protect this gift from those who would exploit it for mere profit. Hold fast to what matters most, dear cousin. Some treasures are too valuable to be sold. Your repentant relative, Ezra Brenneman, P.S. The environmental lawyers I have been working with are good people who understand our values. Dr. Sarah Chung has been more than a scientific consultant. She's become a true friend who believes in protecting this discovery for the right reasons. Trust them both, and remember that sometimes God's greatest gifts come disguised as the heaviest burdens. Levi, read the letter 3 times before its full implications sank in. Ezra hadn't just stumbled onto mineral deposits by accident. He had been actively working to protect them from exploitation, building a network of allies who shared his vision of responsible stewardship. The black sheep of the family had spent his final years acting more like an Amish elder than anyone had realized. But even as relief washed over him at learning about the legal protections, Levi felt a new weight settling on his shoulders. The decision was still his to make, and now he understood the full scope of what hung in the balance. The drive home from the bank took place in a haze of conflicting emotions. Part of him felt vindicated. Ezra's preparations proved that the discovery was meant to be protected rather than exploited. But another part of him felt overwhelmed by the responsibility his cousin had placed on his shoulders. How could one aging farmer stand up to corporations with unlimited resources and political connections? The answer came from an unexpected source. When Levi arrived at his farmhouse, he found Dr. Sarah Chun waiting on his front porch with a woman he didn't recognize, a sharp-eyed lawyer who introduced herself as Maria Santos from the Environmental Defense League. "Mr. Brenneman," Dr. Chun said, her voice filled with quiet intensity, "we need to talk. The situation is more urgent than any of us realized." As they settled around his kitchen table, the same table where Sarah's recipe box still lay open, Maria Santos spread out a collection of documents that made Levi's pulse quicken. "Keystone Mining filed preliminary permits with the state yesterday," she explained, pointing to official forms covered with corporate letterhead. "They're claiming mineral rights through a legal technicality, something about prior survey work done in the area. They're trying to establish legal standing to begin operations, whether local landowners consent or not. But that's impossible," Levi protested. "The mineral rights were specifically protected in the original deed." Maria Santos smiled grimly. "They're counting on the fact that most rural landowners don't have the resources to fight a prolonged legal battle, even when they have valid legal protections. Their strategy is to overwhelm you with paperwork, bureaucratic procedures, and legal costs until selling becomes your only practical option." Dr. Chun leaned forward. "But your cousin was brilliant, Mr. Brenneman. The legal protections he arranged are ironclad, and the documentation he collected proves that Keystone Mining's claims are fraudulent. With the right legal representation, we can not only defeat their current efforts, but expose their tactics publicly. Which brings me to why I'm here," Maria Santos added. "The Environmental Defense League has been tracking Keystone Mining's operations across the country. They've used these same tactics to force sales in dozens of communities, destroying family farms and devastating rural environments. But they've never faced a case with this level of legal protection and scientific documentation." She paused, studying Levi's weathered face. "Mr. Brenneman, if you're willing to fight this battle, you won't be fighting alone. We have the resources and expertise to take on Keystone Mining, and your case could set a legal precedent that protects other communities facing similar threats." As evening shadows gathered outside his kitchen windows, Levi found himself faced with a choice that would define not just his own future, but the future of his entire community. Ezra's final letter lay open on the table beside Sarah's recipe for friendship bread. Two different kinds of wisdom offering guidance for the most important decision of his life. The hand-forged key that had unlocked his cousin's secrets lay heavy. In his palm, its weight a tangible reminder that some doors, once opened, could never be closed again. But as he looked at the faces gathered around his table, Dr. Chen's scientific passion, Maria Santos's legal determination, and his own family's quiet strength, Levi began to understand that Ezra's true gift wasn't the mineral wealth itself. It was the opportunity to prove that a community, united by faith and principle, could stand against any force that threatened what they held most dear. The courthouse in Lancaster had never seen anything quite like the scene that unfolded on the morning of October 15th. Two worlds collided in its marble corridors as Keystone Mining's team of corporate lawyers wheeled in boxes of legal documents, while Levi Brenneman arrived in his horse-drawn buggy, accompanied by a small delegation of Amish elders who had finally understood what was at stake for their entire community. The weeks leading up to this moment had transformed not just Levi's life, but the fabric of their settlement in ways that would have been unimaginable just months earlier. What had begun as one man's quiet restoration of a forgotten farm had become a battle for the soul of a way of life that had endured for centuries. The turning point had come during a community meeting held in the Stoltzfus barn, where Bishop Ella had finally called the entire district together to address the rumors and concerns that had been dividing families and friends. Levi had stood before his neighbors, people who had known him since childhood, who had worked alongside him through decades of harvests and hardships, and told them everything. The silence that followed his explanation had been profound. Men who had spent their lives working soil that might contain unimaginable wealth. Women who had raised children on land that could make them millionaires. Elderly folks who had lived through the Depression, understanding that such money could ensure security for generations of grandchildren. It was Anna Stoltzfus, the bishop's wife, who had spoken first. Her voice had carried across the barn with the quiet authority that comes from 70 years of living according to principle rather than convenience. Levi Brenneman, she had said, rising from her bench with the careful dignity of advanced age. You have been carrying a terrible burden alone, and that was wrong of us to allow. But more importantly, you have shown us what it means to value stewardship over ownership, community over individual gain. If these English corporations think they can destroy our way of life for profit, they have forgotten what our people are made of. The transformation in community support had been swift and decisive. Families who had been whispering about Levi's strange behavior now offered labor and resources for the legal battle ahead. Young men volunteered to help with his farm work so he could focus on the court proceedings. Women organized meal trains to ensure that Rebecca and Jacob were cared for during the long days of legal preparation. But perhaps most importantly, other property owners throughout the area began to understand their own vulnerability. When Jeremiah Miller discovered that Keystone Mining had been quietly approaching his neighbors with increasingly aggressive buyout offers, he had become one of Levi's strongest allies. They came to my place again yesterday. He had told Levi during one of their strategy sessions at the kitchen table that had become an unofficial war room. This time, Webb brought two other men-bigger fellows who didn't say much but made their presence known. Webb said the company was prepared to make me an offer I couldn't refuse, but the way he said it didn't sound like an offer at all. The intimidation tactics had backfired spectacularly. Instead of frightening rural families into submission, Keystone Mining's heavy-handed approach had awakened something that the company's urban executives didn't understand. The fierce independence and mutual support that had enabled Amish communities to thrive for generations despite outside pressure. Maria Santos had been amazed by the community's response. In most cases like this, families get picked off one by one, She had explained to Levi as they prepared for the court hearing. The mining companies isolate property owners, make them feel like they're fighting alone against impossible odds. But your community has done the opposite. You've united around shared values that are stronger than any financial pressure. Dr. Chun had provided the scientific foundation for their legal defense. Her decades of geological expertise, giving weight to arguments that Keystone Mining's environmental impact assessments were fraudulent and incomplete. What they're proposing would require removing hundreds of feet of topsoil and using chemical processing techniques that would contaminate groundwater for decades. She had testified during the preliminary hearings. This isn't mining, it's environmental destruction on an industrial scale. But the real strength of their case lay in the documents Ezra had so carefully preserved. The original 1847 deed with its ironclad mineral rights protections had been authenticated by 3 independent historical experts. Ezra's own geological surveys, conducted over 15 years with university-level precision, provided detailed documentation that Keystone Mining's claims were based on falsified data. Most damaging to the corporation's case was the discovery of internal company emails that Maria Santos had obtained through legal discovery procedures. The messages revealed a callous disregard for local communities and a deliberate strategy of using legal intimidation to force property sales from ignorant, rural families who don't understand the value of what they're sitting on. As the final hearing approached, Levi found himself caught between profound gratitude for his community's support and deep anxiety about the responsibility he carried. The outcome would affect not just his own family, but dozens of neighboring farms and the future of their entire way of life. The night before the court date, he had walked alone to Sarah's garden, now overgrown with autumn weeds, but still peaceful in the moonlight. Standing among the remnants of her carefully tended flowers, he had felt her presence more strongly than at any time since her death. "I don't know if I'm strong enough for this, Sarah," he had whispered to the night air. "These corporate people have more money and lawyers than I can count. What if I fail? What if I can't protect what you and I built here?" The answer had come not in words, but in memory, Sarah's hands teaching Jacob to plant seeds, her voice explaining that gardens grew, strong not through force, but through patience and faith, her absolute certainty that things planted with love would flourish even after the planter was gone. Now, as he sat in the courthouse corridor waiting for their case to be called, Levi felt that same quiet certainty settling over him. In his jacket pocket, he carried the hand-forged key that had unlocked Ezra's final gift. Its iron weight, a reminder that some treasures were protected not by hiding them away, but by ensuring they served purposes larger than individual gain. Jacob sat beside him on the wooden bench, his 8-year-old eyes wide as he took in the marble columns and formal atmosphere of the courthouse. The boy had insisted on coming, despite Rebecca's concerns about exposing him to what promised to be a contentious legal battle. "Dottie," Jacob whispered, "are the bad men really going to try to take away our treasure?" "They're going to try, little one, but they don't understand what our real treasure is." "What do you mean?" Levi looked around the corridor at the faces of his community members who had come to support him. Bishop Stoltzfus sat quietly reading his Bible, projecting the same calm dignity that had guided their settlement through decades of challenges. Anna Stoltzfus worked on a piece of needlepoint, her steady hands creating beauty even in this tense environment. Jeremiah Miller and his son stood near the windows, their farmer's eyes studying the urban landscape beyond the glass with quiet skepticism. "Our real treasure isn't buried in the ground, Jacob. It's right here in this room. People who care more about each other than about money. Families who've worked together for generations. Neighbors who help each other through difficult times. That's worth more than any mineral deposit." Dr. Chun appeared at Levi's elbow, her expression tense with pre-battle nerves. "The hearing is about to begin. Are you ready for this?" Levi stood, feeling the weight of his 65 years, but also the strength that came from knowing he wasn't fighting alone. As ready as anyone can be when they're defending their home, Maria Santos joined them, her arms full of legal documents. That represented months of preparation. Remember, we have right on our side. The evidence is overwhelming. The legal precedents are clear, and Keystone Mining's tactics have been exposed. But corporate lawyers are skilled at creating confusion and delay. Stay focused on what matters most. As they filed into the courtroom, Levi caught sight of Marcus Webb sitting with a phalanx of expensive attorneys, his face wearing the same predatory smile that had marked their first encounter at the farm. The mining company's legal team looked confident, even arrogant, their expensive suits and briefcases radiating the kind of power that money could buy. But as Levi took his seat at the plaintiff's table, surrounded by the quiet strength of his community and supported by allies who understood that some battles were worth fighting regardless of the odds, he felt something he hadn't expected, a deep sense of peace. Ezra's final letter lay folded in his jacket pocket alongside the iron key, its words offering guidance across the years. Hold fast to what matters most, dear cousin. Some treasures are too valuable to be sold. The judge entered the courtroom, and as everyone rose to their feet, Levi offered a silent prayer, not for victory, but for wisdom. The wisdom to know the difference between treasure that enriched the soul and wealth that impoverished the spirit, between stewardship that protected future generations and ownership that served only the present moment. The battle for Ezra's land was about to begin, but Levi understood now that the real fight was for something far more precious than mineral deposits. It was a fight for the right of communities to preserve their values in the face of forces that would sacrifice anything: land, water, way of life, human dignity, on the altar of corporate profit. As the court clerk called their case number, Levi Brenneman stood ready to prove that sometimes the greatest treasures are discovered not by digging deeper into the earth, but by standing firm on the ground where your ancestors planted the seeds of faith, family, and community that had sustained them through centuries of storms. The Honorable Judge Margaret Winters had presided over hundreds of property disputes during her 20-year career, but she had never seen a case quite like the one that unfolded in her courtroom that October morning. On one side sat a team of corporate attorneys representing interests worth billions of dollars. On the other sat a 65-year-old Amish farmer whose greatest legal experience had been registering deeds at the county courthouse. "Your Honor," began Keystone Mining's lead attorney, Thomas Richardson, his voice carrying the polished confidence that came from winning cases through superior resources rather than superior arguments. "This is fundamentally a simple matter of property law and economic development. My client has invested substantial resources in geological surveys and environmental assessments that demonstrate the significant mineral potential of the defendant's property." Richardson moved to a display board covered with official-looking charts and graphs. "The state has a compelling interest in ensuring that valuable natural resources are developed responsibly for the benefit of Pennsylvania's economy. Mr. Brenneman's sentimental attachment to this property cannot be allowed to prevent legitimate commercial development that would create jobs and generate millions in tax revenue." Maria Santos rose from her seat with the quiet intensity of a lawyer who had spent years defending communities against exactly this kind of corporate aggression. "Your Honor, Keystone Mining would have this court believe that property rights can be arbitrarily overruled whenever a corporation decides that profit justifies seizure. But the evidence will show that their claims are based on fraudulent surveys, manipulated data, and a fundamental misunderstanding of Pennsylvania mineral rights law." She approached the bench, carrying a leather portfolio that contained Ezra's carefully preserved documentation. "The plaintiff's mineral rights are protected by an 1847 land grant that specifically prohibits the severance of surface and subsurface rights. More importantly, Keystone Mining's own internal documents, obtained through legal discovery, reveal a pattern of intimidation and deception, designed to force property sales from rural families. Judge Winters studied the documents with the careful attention of someone who understood that precedents set in her courtroom could affect property owners throughout the state. Ms. Santos, what specific evidence do you have that Keystone Mining's geological surveys were fraudulent? Dr. Chun rose from the gallery, where she had been sitting with the Amish community members. Your Honor, I am Dr. Sarah Chun, Professor Emeritus of Geological Sciences at Millersville University. I have reviewed both Keystone Mining geological assessments and the independent research conducted by Levi Brenneman over a 15-year period. She moved to a table where she had arranged rock samples and scientific instruments. Keystone Mining surveys claim to have found significant rare earth deposits throughout Mr. Brenneman's property. However, their sampling methods were inadequate. Their chemical analyses were incomplete, and their conclusions are not supported by the actual geological evidence. Richardson objected sharply. Your Honor, Dr. Chun is not a certified mining engineer and has no expertise in commercial mineral extraction. Actually, Mr. Richardson, I am a certified geological engineer with 30 years of experience in mineral assessment, Dr. Chun replied calmly. And I have something that Keystone Mining lacks: genuine rock samples taken systematically from the disputed property over more than a decade. She held up a small specimen container. This sample was taken by Levi Brenneman from the exact location where Keystone Mining claims to have found their richest deposits. Independent laboratory analysis shows rare earth concentrations that are indeed significant, but the formations are far more complex and environmentally sensitive than Keystone Mining's assessments indicate. Judge Winters leaned forward with interest. Dr. Chun, what is your professional opinion about the feasibility of mining operations on this property? Your Honor, the mineral deposits are real and valuable. However, they exist in geological formations. That would require extraction methods guaranteed to contaminate groundwater for dozens of miles around the site. Keystone Mining's environmental impact statement completely ignores these risks, suggesting either incompetence or deliberate misrepresentation. The breakthrough moment came when Maria Santos introduced evidence that Keystone Mining's executives had never anticipated seeing in open court. She approached the bench carrying a folder marked Confidential Internal Communications. Your Honor, I present Exhibit A, internal emails from Keystone Mining executives discussing their strategy for acquiring property in Lancaster County. She read from a printed document. These Amish farmers don't understand legal complexity. Pressure them with bureaucratic procedures and threats of eminent domain. Most will sell rather than fight a prolonged legal battle they can't afford. The courtroom erupted in murmurs as the implications of the corporate strategy became clear. Judge Winters called for order, but her expression had hardened noticeably as she studied the evidence. Richardson attempted damage control. Your Honor, internal corporate communications taken out of context cannot, Mr. Richardson. Judge Winters interrupted. These communications appear to document a deliberate pattern of intimidation, targeting a specific religious community. I will need to review all related correspondence before proceeding. But it was the presentation of Ezra's mining engineer certificate that provided the most dramatic moment of the hearing. Levi had discovered the document that morning, tucked inside a geological textbook in the safety deposit box. The certificate, issued by the Pennsylvania Board of Professional Engineers, proved that his cousin had possessed the highest level of professional credentials for mineral assessment. Your Honor, Maria Santos announced, Levi Brenneman was not an amateur rock collector, as Keystone Mining has suggested. He was a certified professional engineer whose geological surveys meet or exceed industry standards for accuracy and completeness. As the morning session concluded, Judge Winters announced a recess to review the extensive documentation. But the tide had clearly shifted. Keystone Mining's confident legal team now huddled in urgent consultation, while Levi sat surrounded by community members whose faith in the power of truth over money was being vindicated in the most public way possible. The afternoon session began with an unexpected interruption that would become the turning point of the entire case. As Judge Winters prepared to reconvene the hearing, Jacob Brenneman stood up in the gallery and walked purposefully toward the front of the courtroom, carrying a rolled piece of paper in his small hands. "Young man," Judge Winters said gently, "this is not the appropriate time." "Your Honor," Maria Santos intervened, recognizing the significance of what Jacob carried, "I believe the court should see what this child has brought us." Jacob approached the bench with the fearless directness that only children possess when they believe they have something important to share. "Judge lady, I made a map of our treasure, and I want to show it to the bad men so they understand." The hand-drawn map that Jacob unrolled was created with crayons and colored pencils, showing Ezra's property from an 8-year-old's perspective. But what made the adults in the courtroom fall silent was not the child's artistic skill. It was what his innocent vision revealed about the true value of the land. Instead of marking mineral deposits or geological formations, Jacob's map showed the places where he and his grandfather had found baby rabbits in the spring grass. It marked the location of the old apple tree where they ate lunch during their workdays, the clear spring where deer came to drink in the early morning, and the spot where wildflowers bloomed in such profusion that his great-grandmother Sarah had once gathered bouquets there. "See?" Jacob said, pointing to various locations on his map with complete seriousness. "This is where the treasure really is. Not the rocks underground that nobody can see, but all the beautiful things that grow on top. And this," he pointed to a carefully drawn house and barn, "this is where Dottie and I are going to build the most wonderful farm in the whole world." The courtroom had grown completely quiet as Jacob continued his explanation, his child's wisdom cutting through legal complexities to the heart of what was really at stake. "The bad men want to dig big holes and break everything, but Dottie says that's not what treasure is for. Treasure is for taking care of people and making beautiful things grow." Judge Winters found herself leaning forward, drawn in despite herself by the boy's earnest presentation. "Jacob, what makes you think the land is treasure?" "Because when me and Dottie work there, it makes us happy. And when things make you happy and help other people, that's what treasure is. Not just money that makes people fight and be mean to each other." Richardson stood to object, but Judge Winters waved him back to his seat. Something in the child's testimony had struck her as more relevant to the case than hours of legal argument. Levi rose from his seat, his weathered face showing both pride in his grandson and deep emotion at hearing his own values reflected in such pure terms. "Your Honor, if I may speak?" "Proceed, Mr. Brenneman." "Jacob has drawn a map of something that no geological survey can measure, the value of land to the people who love it, who tend it, who see it as home rather than just a resource to be exploited." Levi's voice carried the quiet authority of a man who had spent decades learning what truly mattered in life. "My cousin Ezra left me mineral wealth worth hundreds of millions of dollars. But more importantly, he left me a choice to value stewardship over ownership, community over individual profit. The mining company sees only dollars per ton of rare earth elements. My grandson sees a place where life can flourish for generations if we're wise enough to protect it." Levi moved to stand beside Jacob, placing his hand gently on the boy's shoulder. "Your Honor, I could sell this land today and never worry about money again. But what would I tell Jacob when he grows up and asks why I chose temporary wealth over permanent values? What would I tell my wife's memory, knowing that I traded away the kind of place where she found joy in simple, everyday beauty?" The silence that followed was broken by an unexpected voice from the gallery. Anna Stoltzfus, the bishop's wife, stood with the careful dignity of her 70 years. Your Honor, I have lived in this community for my entire life, and I have watched corporations come and go, each one promising prosperity while leaving behind environmental damage that our children and grandchildren will inherit. But I have also watched families like the Brennemans create prosperity that grows stronger with each generation. Prosperity built on stewardship, mutual support, and respect for the land that sustains us. She paused, looking directly at the Keystone Mining legal team. These corporate gentlemen offer money that will be spent and forgotten within a few years. Levi Brenneman offers something far more valuable, proof that communities can choose principles over profit and find themselves richer for the choice. Judge Winters studied Jacob's colorful map one final time before rendering her decision. In it, she saw not just a child's artwork, but a different way of measuring value entirely, one that prioritized stewardship over extraction, community over corporation, and the long view over short-term gain. The court will recess to consider all testimony and evidence, she announced. But I want to commend young Mr. Brenneman for reminding us that some treasures cannot be measured in dollars and cents, and that the highest use of valuable resources is not always their immediate exploitation. As the courtroom emptied, Levi held his grandson's small hand and felt a profound sense of gratitude, not for the mineral wealth beneath his feet, but for the wisdom of a child who understood that real treasure was meant to be shared, not hoarded. 1 year later, the wooden sign that stood at the entrance to what was now known as Brenneman Heritage Farm bore testament to the power of community over corporation, principle over profit. Hand-carved by volunteers from throughout the settlement, and painted by Jacob himself in careful letters, it read, Brenneman Heritage Farm, preserved for future generations. The legal victory over Keystone Mining had been complete and decisive. Judge Winters' ruling not only upheld the mineral rights, protections in Ezra's deed, but established a precedent that would protect rural communities across Pennsylvania from similar corporate predation. The mining company's fraudulent surveys and intimidation tactics had been exposed in detail, resulting in state investigations that led to criminal charges against several executives. But for Levi, the real victory lay in what had been built rather than what had been prevented. The farm that neighbors had once called Heartbreak Hill had been transformed into something remarkable, not through the extraction of mineral wealth, but through the application of patient love and community effort. The old barn now stood straight and proud, its red paint gleaming in the autumn sunshine. The farmhouse, rebuilt with help from dozens of volunteers, served as a community center where families gathered for celebrations, meetings, and the kind of mutual support that had always been the foundation of Amish life. Most importantly, the mineral deposits remained safely underground, protected by a conservation trust that Levi had established with the help of Maria Santos and Dr. Chun. The trust ensured that the land would never be sold to mining companies while generating modest income through carefully managed sustainable agriculture and educational programs about environmental stewardship. Dottie, look what I found. Jacob's voice carried across the restored barnyard as he ran toward his grandfather, his 9-year-old face bright with discovery. In his hands, he carried a perfect arrowhead, probably left by the same Susquehannock people whose pottery fragment had first suggested the land's deeper significance. That's a treasure indeed, little one, Levi said, accepting the artifact with the reverence it deserved. Another piece of the story this land has been trying to tell us. They stood together in the place where Marcus Webb had first approached, with promises of easy money and veiled threats of corporate power. Now it was a place where children played safely, where neighbors gathered for barn raisings and harvest celebrations, where the ancient spring ran clear and deer still came to drink in the early morning. Dr. Chun approached from the vegetable garden where she had been helping Rebecca with the late harvest. At 73, the retired professor had found new purpose as the farm's resident naturalist. leading educational programs for school children and documenting the remarkable biodiversity that thrived when land was protected rather than exploited. "Levi," she said, her voice warm with satisfaction, "the soil samples from the North Field show remarkable improvement over last year. The organic farming methods are not only sustainable, but actually enhancing the long-term fertility of the land." It was a vindication of everything Ezra had hoped for in his final letter, proof that valuable resources could be preserved and enhanced rather than consumed. The rare earth deposits remained untouched beneath their feet, their enormous monetary value transformed into something far more precious. The security of knowing that future generations would inherit a world improved rather than depleted by the choices made today. Samuel emerged from the restored barn, his face showing the kind of satisfaction that came from work done well in service of something larger than profit. At 43, he had become the farm's manager, overseeing operations that combined traditional Amish agricultural wisdom with modern conservation techniques. "Dad, the delegation from Ohio is arriving tomorrow morning," he reported. 3. More Amish communities facing mining company pressure want to learn about our conservation trust model. The Brenneman Heritage Farm had become something neither Levi nor Ezra could have anticipated, a demonstration that communities could successfully resist corporate exploitation while creating models of sustainable prosperity that enriched everyone involved. Requests for information came from rural communities across the country, and Maria Santos had used their legal victory as the foundation for new laws, protecting family farms from predatory corporate practices. But the most meaningful measure of success was visible in the faces of the people who had gathered for the farm's first anniversary celebration. Bishop Stoltzfus offered a blessing for the meal that emphasized gratitude not for wealth accumulated, but for wisdom gained. Anna Stoltzfus presented a quilt she had made depicting the farm's transformation, each carefully stitched panel telling part of the story of how a community had chosen principle over profit and found themselves richer for the choice. Rebecca stood with her arm around Jacob's shoulders, her face showing the peace that came from knowing her son would grow up in a world where the right values had prevailed. The worry lines that had marked her features during the legal battle had faded, replaced by the quiet confidence of someone who had witnessed the power of faith in action. As evening shadows lengthened across the restored fields, Levi found himself standing in Sarah's garden, now lovingly maintained by community volunteers as a memorial to the woman whose values had guided every decision. The daffodils that had survived decades of neglect now flourished among carefully tended roses, herbs, and the wildflowers that Jacob insisted should be allowed to grow wherever they chose. The wooden cross his father had carved still hung in the farmhouse kitchen, its simple beauty a reminder that the most valuable treasures were often the ones that couldn't be bought or sold. Ezra's journal lay on the mantel beside it, its pages filled with scientific observations that had ultimately served not corporate profit but community preservation. In his jacket pocket, Levi still carried the brass compass that had once pointed toward mineral deposits worth hundreds of millions of dollars, but now it pointed towards something far more valuable, a future where communities could thrive by choosing stewardship over exploitation, where children like Jacob could inherit not just wealth, but the wisdom to use it well, where the true measure of prosperity was not what could be extracted from the earth, but what could be built upon it with patience, love, and the deep understanding that some treasures grow more valuable when they're shared. The Heritage Farm stood as proof that sometimes the greatest discoveries were not found by digging deeper into the ground, but by standing firmly on principles that had been tested by time and proven stronger than any force that money could buy.